The report from Guadalcanal arrives at General Harukichi Hyakutaki's headquarters in Rabaul at the end of August 1942. The officer who delivers it has already read it twice. Colonel Kiyono Ichiki commanded 916 men, veterans, soldiers who had fought in China, in Manchuria, men with combat records that stretched back years before the Pacific War had a name. They had landed on Guadalcanal with orders to retake Henderson Field from the American Marines who had seized it 3 weeks earlier. The plan was a night assault at the mouth of Alligator Creek, bayonets, momentum, the American perimeter broken before dawn. Plan was built on an intelligence assessment that described the Marines holding that perimeter as exhausted remnants, demoralized, barely functional as a fighting force. By 5:30 in the morning on August 21st, 800 of Ichiki's men were dead. Hyakutake reads the report. He reads it again. He asks about survivors. There are almost none. The Marines who held that perimeter, the 1st Marine Division, had met the attack with machine guns and barbed wire, and flanking positions the Japanese assault force had not accounted for. They were not exhausted remnants. They were the 1st Marine Division, and they had barely slept. Ichiki himself, shamed beyond what his code allowed, had burned his regimental colors in the coconut palms and shot himself before the day was properly over. The intelligence assessment had said the Marines would break. The Marines had counterattacked. That was not in the assessment. Hyakutake sits with the report for a moment. Then he orders another assault. If you're already wondering why the next assault produced the same result, and the same report, and the same refusal to revise the assessment, so are the historians. Stay with this. These documents, these letters, these after-action reports are preserved in archives in Tokyo and Washington. They deserve to be read by more than specialists. Subscribe if you want us to keep pulling them out. We read every comment. To understand what Japanese commanders kept encountering on those Pacific islands, you need to understand what they had been told to expect. The Imperial Japanese Army's doctrine in 1941 centered on a concept called Seishin, translated roughly as fighting spirit. The doctrine was not a motivational slogan. It was built into Japanese tactical planning at every level, from battalion training to strategic assessment. The argument was direct. A soldier's determination to die for the emperor would overcome disadvantages in material and numbers. Seishin had worked in China. It had worked against British forces in Malaya, against Dutch forces in the East Indies, against American forces in the Philippines in those first months of the war. Japanese attacks that a rational calculation of force ratios should have stopped had not been stopped. The intelligence assessment that sent Ichiki toward Alligator Creek was not invented from nothing. It drew on observable evidence. American forces in the Philippines had surrendered in large numbers. American public sentiment before Pearl Harbor had been against the war. Japanese military analysis held that individualism, the preference for personal survival over collective sacrifice, would become decisive under pressure. Americans would fight hard enough to preserve their pride, then stop when the cost became too high. This reading was wrong in general, and was wrong about the Marines, specifically in ways that the assessment had no mechanism for discovering in advance. The Marine Corps had been training since before the United States had been a country. By 1942, that training had settled into something that Marine instructors described, without apparent irony, as dismantling a man and rebuilding him as part of a unit. Recruit training at Parris Island and San Diego was designed to replace individual self-preservation with a different calculation entirely. The unit survived. You were part of the unit. Your job, stripped to its most basic statement, was to close with the enemy and destroy him. And that job did not stop because the situation was dangerous or because your unit had taken casualties. The Marines had also been given, in quantities Japanese officers found difficult to account for, food, ammunition, medical support, and replacement personnel. Supply appeared off Pacific islands on cargo ships in numbers that garrison commanders watching from shore consistently, as impossible to exhaust. Seishin could carry a man past his fear. It could not manufacture rifle rounds. The Marines brought both. Guadalcanal would spend 6 months teaching this to any Japanese officer sent to learn it. Major General Kiyotake Kawaguchi arrived on Guadalcanal with roughly 3,000 men in September 1942. His orders were to retake Henderson Field, The plan involved a coordinated attack across Edson's Ridge, a piece of elevated ground between the Japanese approach routes and the airfield. Kawaguchi was not an inexperienced commander. He had led successful operations in Borneo. His plan was reasonably designed. On the nights of September 12th and 13th, his forces attacked the ridge. Lieutenant Colonel Merritt Edson's Marines held it. Fighting lasted 2 nights and cost Kawaguchi over 1,200 men. The Marines bent badly in the first night, fell back to shorter perimeters, and were still on the ridge when morning came. Kawaguchi's after-action report, portions of which survive in Japanese military records from the period, contain something unusual for documents of its type. He noted that Marine units had reinforced positions under direct fire at speeds and with organizational coherence he had not encountered in any previous engagement. He wrote that units taking serious casualties continued attacking with what he described as unchanged determination. He recommended against further frontal attacks on Marine defensive positions. He was relieved of command shortly after. The relief was attributed officially to the operation's failure. His report may have contributed. The next attack on Henderson Field came in October, General Masao Maruyama with a larger force. It produced the same result at greater cost. Pattern that runs through the Guadalcanal campaign is not a story of incompetent Japanese commanders making avoidable errors. The officers who fought there were professional soldiers. What the pattern it describes is a calculation that kept producing the wrong answer because one of its inputs was wrong. Every Japanese officer who fought the Marines on that island filed a version of the same assessment. Specifics differed by unit and engagement. The core observation was consistent. These men do not stop when they should stop. They attack through circumstances that would end any offensive we have conducted against any other opponent. Imperial General Headquarters received these reports throughout the campaign. The formal response was measured. American material advantage was acknowledged. Requests for reinforcement were processed. The Doctrine's assessment of American fighting spirit remained officially unchanged. Guadalcanal was evacuated in February 1943. Japan had lost approximately 25,000 men there, most to disease and starvation in the final months when Marine and Army units had severed the island's supply lines. The strategic initiative in the Pacific had moved. A different lesson could have been drawn from Guadalcanal. The lesson Tokyo chose was that larger forces, better supplied, would produce different results. Rear Admiral Keiji Shibazaki commanded the Japanese garrison on Betio Island in the Tarawa Atoll when the 2nd Marine Division arrived offshore on November 20, 1943. His fortifications were thorough. Betio was 800 acres of coral. His garrison numbered approximately 4,500 men. The gun positions covered the beaches from overlapping angles. The concrete bunkers had been built to survive naval bombardment. His personal assessment, as documented in pre-war Japanese inspection records of the position, was that the island would withstand any realistic amphibious assault. The first day of the Marine landing was catastrophic for the attackers. Landing craft grounded on offshore reefs far short of the beach. Marines crossed hundreds of yards of open water in chest-deep surf under direct fire from positions they could not yet reach. By evening, the Marines had a foothold measured in yards, with casualties severe enough that some American commanders were genuinely uncertain whether the operation could continue. The Marines attacked the next morning, and the morning after that. Betio fell in 76 hours. Of 4,500 Japanese defenders, 17 survived as prisoners of war. Marine casualties exceeded 1,000 killed and 2,000 wounded across those 3 days on 800 acres of coral. Shibazaki had been killed by naval gunfire in the opening hours, which meant no Japanese senior commander on Betio filed a complete after-action assessment. The summary that reached Japanese officers elsewhere in the Pacific had to speak for itself. A Japanese naval officer serving in the Marshall Islands, whose personal diary survived the war, wrote, after reading the Tarawa account, that American Marines appeared to operate under different constraints regarding attrition than any force the Japanese military had previously documented. He wrote this in his private diary, not in any official report. He understood what filing that observation officially would imply about the doctrine. He was not wrong about the implication. He kept the diary and said nothing official. The diary of that Marshall Islands officer, Kawaguchi's after-action reports, Kuribayashi's letters home, all of these documents are preserved and accessible. Most people who watch documentaries about the Pacific War never encounter the Japanese side of paper trail, the reports that were filed and read and did not change anything in time to matter. If that's the kind of history you want, subscribe. We take every comment. Drop your country below. Lieutenant General Tadamichi Kuribayashi was assigned to command the defense of Iwo Jima in June 1944. Among all the Japanese officers who would fight the Marines across the Pacific War, he was the one who had already answered the question before anyone formally asked it. Kuribayashi had served in the United States in the late 1920s as a military attaché. He had traveled across North America, watched American industrial cities at full operation, studied an economy and a production capacity that his official reports could describe in figures but could not fully convey. His letters to his wife during that posting were kept by his family, and those letters are among the most cited personal documents in studies of the Pacific War. He described American industrial capacity in them, in the careful language of a military assessment, but with the frank reaction of a man encountering something outside his previous scale of reference. He wrote that Japan should not go to war with the United States. He was a junior officer. His opinion on grand strategy was not being solicited. He wrote it anyway, to his wife, in letters she kept for decades. He was a general by 1944, commanding an island that a country which had ignored what he could not officially say had ordered him to defend. Kuribayashi understood that Iwo Jima would fall. He designed his defenses around this understanding rather than against it. The tunnel system his engineers built under the volcanic rock was intended to survive the pre-landing naval bombardment that marine amphibious doctrine prescribed before any beach assault. His orders to the garrison were explicit, preserved in Japanese military records. They were not to hold the island. Their purpose was to make the cost of taking it as high as possible, to buy time, to force American strategic planners to reconsider the pace of their advance toward the Japanese home islands. His letters to his family in the weeks before the American landing grew careful in a specific way. No despair appears directly in them. What appears instead is the attention he pays to practical matters. Instructions for his household, guidance for circumstances that will arise after his death. He was closing his accounts in the only medium available to him. To Imperial General Headquarters, he was filing a different kind of correspondence. His operational reports from Iwo Jima, compiled from surviving records after the war, stand apart from most Japanese military documentation of the period. He does not attribute Marine performance entirely to material advantage. He describes Marine small unit leaders as making independent decisions in engagements, adapting to specific tactical situations without waiting for orders from above, in ways that Japanese doctrine had not prepared his defenders to counter. He notes that Marine units maintain offensive momentum after casualties that would, in any engagement he had previously studied or participated in, produce a halt. He was describing a problem his defenses were designed to address but could not solve. The tunnels, the interconnected positions, the design intended to survive the opening bombardment and make every Marine advance cost the maximum, were built by a man who had seen American factories in 1928 and understood what was coming behind those Marines across 3,000 miles of Pacific water. Tokyo received these assessments. Tokyo had been receiving versions of these assessments since August 1942. The official doctrine did not change. Here is the expanded segment at 1,800 words. The battle for Iwo Jima began on February 19, 1945. The 4th and 5th Marine Divisions hit the beaches at 9 like summer in the morning. The pre-landing naval bombardment had been running for 3 days. It had been the heaviest sustained shelling of any Pacific island to that point in the war. Aboard the ships offshore, officers watching through binoculars at the volcanic rock and black sand beaches had reason to believe the garrison inside those positions had been degraded beyond the capacity for organized resistance. Kuribayashi's tunnels had absorbed it all. When the Marines crossed the beach and moved inland, the fire that came down on them was coordinated, concentrated, and coming from positions the bombardment had not touched. The casualties on that first day were severe enough that senior commanders offshore genuinely considered whether the operation could proceed. The beach itself was chaos, landing craft grounded, equipment bunched, men moving through volcanic ash that swallowed their ankles at every step, crossing open ground toward fortifications they could not yet see. The Marines moved forward. They kept moving forward. The battle lasted 36 days. Nearly 7,000 Marines were killed. Over 19,000 were wounded. Of approximately 22,000 Japanese defenders, roughly 18,000 died in the fighting. 216 were taken prisoner. The rest died in the tunnels in the final organized actions, in ones and twos in the last days when there was nothing left to organize. Kuribayashi was killed in the final days, leading what remained of his garrison in a last action. His body was never definitively identified. The man who had watched American factories in the late 1920s and written to his wife about what they meant, who had been ignored by an institution that could not afford to hear him, who had built his defense around the understanding that the island would fall and tried to make the cost of taking it as high as possible, died somewhere in the volcanic rock of Iwo Jima without a grave history has located. He had written his final message to Imperial General Headquarters several days before the end. The message was precise. It described the battle as his correspondents throughout the operation had described it, without diminishment of the enemy, and without pretense about outcomes. He noted the garrison had made the Americans pay heavily. He assessed Marine performance, as he had assessed it in every previous report, as a force that did not stop when, by every measure his doctrine gave him, stopping was indicated. He did not suggest different resources, or a different plan would have produced a different result. That observation, from that particular officer who had held knowledge of American capacity since before the war had a name, was among the most honest things anyone in the Japanese military committed to paper while the Pacific War was still being fought. The Guadalcanal reports and the Tarawa summary and the Iwo Jima assessments are read in sequence. They describe a problem that the Japanese military had documented repeatedly and addressed once. The problem was not that Marines were better supplied, though they were. The problem was not that American naval gunfire was overwhelming, though it often was. The problem, stated in military language across years of after-action reports, was that Marine units continued attacking through attrition rates that, in every previous engagement, Japanese commanders had participated in or studied would produce a halt. Kawaguchi said it in September 1942. He was relieved of command. The Marshall Islands officer wrote it in his diary in 1943 because saying it officially was not available to him. Kuribayashi had said it before there was a war to report on, and he had built his entire defensive doctrine for Iwo Jima around the assumption that amount of resistance would stop the Marines, only slow them, only raise the price. These men were not defeatists. They were professional soldiers trying to convey accurate information to a command structure that had built its operational planning on a premise the information consistently contradicted. The premise was that Americans, specifically, lacked the collective will to sustain a fight past a certain cost. This reading had not been invented. It drew on observable evidence from the first months of the war, from the Philippines surrender, pre-war assessments of American political sentiment. It was a genuine analytical conclusion read through a framework the framework made impossible to update from below. A report saying American Marines had demonstrated fighting will equal to or exceeding Japanese standards did not merely challenge a tactical assessment. It challenged the Seishin doctrine at its foundation. Seishin held that the will to die for the emperor would overcome material disadvantage. A document confirming that the enemy also possessed will, also possessed material advantage, made the arithmetic of the war unsolvable within the doctrine's terms. Institutions do not revise foundational beliefs on the basis of field reports. They file the reports. They request more men. They send another assault. Imperial General Headquarters sent another assault at Guadalcanal after Ichiki, then another after that. The island was evacuated in February 1943. The doctrine remained. What the Marine Corps had built, across the decades between the world wars, was a culture that had internalized a specific answer to the question every combat soldier eventually faces. When does the situation become bad enough to stop? The Marine Corps answer, embedded in training, in unit culture, in the specific language drill instructors used at Paris Island was a studied refusal of the premise. The situation did not determine when you stopped. Your orders determined when you stopped. The enemy was destroyed or you were. There was no condition in between that licensed a halt. This was not recklessness. Marine doctrines spent considerable effort on sustainment. Medical evacuation under fire was standard practice. Dead and wounded came off the field whenever the tactical situation permitted, which Japanese commanders in several engagements noted as a tactically expensive practice that Marine units attained with consistency that suggested it was institutional rather than discretionary. You brought your people back because they were your people, and that did not change when the situation was dangerous. The Marines attacked because that was what Marine units did. They kept attacking because the training said the casualty count was not a variable in the decision to continue, and they were supplied, resupplied, reinforced, and medically supported at a rate that the Japanese garrisons on every contested island could observe but not match, because behind those Marines across 3,000 miles of Pacific water were the American factories Kuribayashi had seen in 1928 and never stopped thinking about. The doctrine that sent Japanese soldiers against that combination was not irrational within its own terms. It had worked. The problem was that it had been built and gathered before it encountered the specific force it was being applied against, and the institutional structure could not revise itself fast enough to incorporate what the field reports were saying. Kawaguchi survived the war. He was repatriated to Japan and lived until 1961. He had been relieved of command after Guadalcanal, spent the remaining years of the war in assignments that kept him away from major operations, and watched from inside Japan as the war moved toward the conclusion he had described without fully stating in his September 1942 report. By the accounts of people who knew him in later life, he thought about Edson's Ridge with some regularity. He thought about the report he had filed, and the recommendation in it, and the decision to continue as before. He had been right about the Marines. He had said so in official military language at a moment when saying it mattered. The institution had filed the document. The Marshall Islands officer, whose diary entry from 1943 survives in a private collection, outlasted the war by many years. His diary was not made available to researchers until decades after his death. He had known better than to commit his observation to official record. He had also known, apparently, that not recording it at all was something he was unwilling to do. The entry sits in the collection, a private verdict on a public war, unacted upon and accurate. Kuribayashi's letters to his wife were collected and published in Japan after the war. The collection became one of the most widely read personal accounts of the Pacific conflict in the Japanese language. Readers, as encountering those letters, find a man who had understood the problem before it became a catastrophe, had said so to the one person he could say it to, and had then gone to do his professional duty inside an institution that had not been able to hear him in time. The three of them had said the same thing. They had said it in official reports and in private diaries and in letters home. The evidence they were working from was real, and it was documented, and it was available to anyone in the command structure who was reading incoming assessments with the intention of revising doctrine rather than confirming it. Tokyo had the paper. Tokyo read the paper. The doctrine did not change. History has its own patience with this kind of problem. The after-action reports are in archives. The letters are published. The diary exists in a private collection that researchers visit. The question every Japanese officer who fought the Marines eventually answered is in the record, preserved in military prose and personal correspondence across years of a war that ended in August 1945. The answer they all reached, through different routes and in different documents, was the same answer. These men do not stop. That observation, filed and read and not acted on, sits in the historical record with a patience that institutions rarely match. It will be there after everyone who made the decisions it describes is gone. It is there now. Most people who encounter the Pacific War in the standard accounts never read this side of the paper trail. These documents deserve a wider audience than the archives that hold them. They deserve to be read. These records are accessible. Kawaguchi's reports, Kuribayashi's letters, the Marshall Islands diary. The paper trail exists. If this is the kind of history you want more of, hit the like button and subscribe. We pull this material out of the places it's been filed and put it where it belongs. Drop your country in the comments. If your family carried any part of this history forward, we want to hear it. We read everyone.